She couldn't see the bruises, only feel them. The world saw her silence and looked away. A blind girl, trapped behind closed doors, with no one to believe her, except a dog who never stopped watching. One night, 4 quiet paws did what no one else dared. They stood between her and the darkness. This isn't just a story about a girl and her dog. It's about the truths we ignore, the pain we don't speak of, and the kind of loyalty that doesn't need words. If you believe love can protect where sight cannot, like this video, subscribe to our channel and stay with us, because some stories don't whisper, they howl. The late autumn wind rolled over the dry hills of Pine Valley, Utah, rustling the golden leaves that clung stubbornly to the oaks lining the narrow road. The sky above was pale gray, threatening snow, though it hadn't yet gathered the strength to fall. A sharp chill settled into the bones of the quiet town, where whispers traveled faster than the wind. Nestled just outside the town center was a brick house with dark green shutters, tidy, symmetrical, cold. It belonged to Bradley Moss. Harper Lee sat stiffly in the back seat of the county vehicle, one small hand gripping the leather handle of her white cane, the other tangled in the thick ruff of fur beside her. She was 7 years old, slight for her age, with soft brown hair falling just below her shoulders, parted by a white clip her mother once gave her. Her eyes were pale gray, clouded, unfocused, not from tears, but from the blindness that had been her companion since the age of 4. Her pale face was turned slightly toward the window, though she saw nothing, only the weight of the moment pressed against her ribs. She didn't speak. Next to her sat Shadow, a large male German shepherd, nearly 80 pounds of muscle and grace. His fur was thick, mostly black, with tan markings on his legs, chest, and face. His ears were always alert, his posture both protective and poised. He had been trained from 2 months old as a guide dog for visually impaired children. But with Harper, his bond ran deeper than training. At 3 years old, Shadow had grown into more than a guide. He was her guardian, her world. Driving the car was Melanie Cross, a 29-year-old social worker who had only recently taken over Harper's case. Melanie was tall and lean, her blonde hair tied into a low bun, glasses perched on her nose, and a faded navy cardigan pulled tight across her shoulders. Her face bore the gentle lines of someone who'd seen too many children, saying goodbye to people they didn't want to leave. She had worked for state child services since her early 20s, but a recent case where she missed warning signs of neglect had left her shaken. Since then, she'd become cautious, hyper-observant, especially when it came to the quiet ones, like Harper. When they pulled into the driveway of Bradley Moss's home, Melanie parked with a sigh and turned in her seat. "Harper, honey, we're here. Do you remember what we talked about?" Harper nodded once, barely. Shadow leaned against her knee, and she reached down to wrap her fingers into the thick fur at his neck. Melanie climbed out and came around to open Harper's door, gently guiding the girl out with practiced patience. The front door opened before they reached the porch. Bradley Moss, Harper's legal guardian and the younger brother of her late father, stepped out with a wide, calculated smile. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with silvering temples and a clean-shaven jaw. His dark eyes were sharp behind expensive glasses, and his clothes, a pressed button-up shirt, neatly creased slacks, suggested order, wealth, and charm. On paper, he was the perfect foster relative, no criminal record, financial stability, and a well-maintained home. But Shadow didn't care about paperwork. The moment they reached the porch, the dog growled a low, rumbling warning that vibrated through Harper's hand. Melanie's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's odd. He's never done that before." Bradley chuckled, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe he's just tired from the drive." He extended his arms with exaggerated warmth. "Welcome home, Harper." Harper stepped back, nudging closer to Shadow. She didn't say anything, but Shadow stayed firmly planted between her and the man. Melanie watched the interaction carefully. "He's trained. He doesn't growl without a reason," she said quietly to herself. The tour of the house was quick. Harper's room was neat, overly so sparse white walls, a bed with hospital-cornered sheets, a dresser and a chair. No photos, no warmth, just sterile space. Bradley showed Melanie his study, the kitchen, the guest room, each area meticulously tidy. He talked easily, laughing as he made small jokes about how Harper would add some life to the house. But the air was wrong. Melanie felt it. And so did Shadow, who remained tense every time Bradley entered a room. After the walkthrough, Melanie knelt beside Harper at the base of the stairs. "Do you want me to stay a little longer?" she whispered. Harper shook her head no, then reached for Shadow's leash again. "Shadow will stay," she said quietly, her first words of the day. Melanie stood slowly. "I'll check in tomorrow, okay?" Bradley walked her to the door with a smoothness that made Melanie's stomach twist. "She'll be just fine. We'll make this feel like home in no time." As the door shut behind her, Melanie paused on the porch, her breath rising in the cold air. She turned back to glance through the side window. Inside, Bradley knelt beside Harper, saying something with a smile. Harper clutched Shadow's leash tighter. The dog's ears were up, eyes locked on the man. Melanie couldn't hear what was said, but her instincts told her that Harper's story wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, the first snow of the season fell quietly over Pine Valley. Harper lay curled on her new bed, clutching a threadbare blanket that still carried her mother's scent. Shadow lay on the floor beside her, eyes open, ears twitching at every creak in the house. Downstairs, Bradley poured himself a drink and sat in the dark, staring out the window. Outside, the world looked peaceful, but inside, something had shifted, and Shadow was the only one who knew it. The snow that had softly blanketed Pine Valley the night Harper arrived had hardened into icy patches along the sidewalks and rooftops, glistening under the dull morning light. The days had grown shorter, the air more brittle, and the sun, when it managed to break through the clouds, cast long, pale shadows across Bradley Moss's front lawn. Harper, bundled in a too large coat, sat on the front step, white cane tucked beside her, fingers wrapped around the warmth of a metal cup filled with cocoa that had long gone cold. She wasn't waiting for anything. She was listening. Inside the house, Bradley paced on a phone call. His voice was polite, low, rehearsed. To everyone else, he was a devoted uncle, taking in his deceased brother's daughter after tragedy struck. But the truth was quieter, more twisted, and only Harper and her dog knew it. Shadow lay beside her, head on his paws, tail unmoving. His fur was dotted with snowflakes, melting slowly into his thick black and tan coat. He hadn't slept in Harper's room since their first night. Bradley had made that clear. "Dogs don't belong in beds," he'd said flatly, shutting the door with Shadow still outside. The dog had whined softly, then curled up at her threshold. That night, Harper cried into her pillow, the darkness behind her eyelids even heavier without the sound of Shadow's breath beside her. It had become a pattern. Every night, Bradley found some reason. He smells, he's loud, he distracts you, to bar Shadow from the room. Sometimes he simply chained him outside to the back fence, where the wind sliced across the yard and the bowl of water froze into a useless disk. Harper never protested. She simply waited until Bradley left the room, then tiptoed down in socks to press her hand against Shadow's fur through the mesh of the gate. One evening, Harper entered the living room slowly, her cane tapping the hardwood. She stopped in front of the fireplace and tilted her head. "Uncle Bradley, my cane's gone." Bradley looked up from his laptop, smiling too broadly. "You must have misplaced it again. Maybe check your room." "It was by the door," she said softly. "Well, it's not now, is it?" he snapped before catching himself. His smile returned. "I'll help you look later." Harper nodded, retreating. She had learned to walk with careful memory, counting steps, tapping walls gently. But each time her furniture was subtly moved, an ottoman shifted, a rug turned sideways. It became a test, a punishment cloaked in inconvenience. At the community center, Harper attended a once-weekly art class for children with disabilities. It was run by a woman named Marla Bixby, a former art teacher in her 60s with tightly curled gray hair and an ever-present smudge of paint on her jeans. She was kind, full-figured, and moved with a limp from a bad car accident years prior. That limp hadn't taken her warmth, though. She greeted each child with the same enthusiasm, often guiding Harper's hands gently to the paper. "You don't need eyes to tell a story," Marla often said. "Your fingers remember what your heart has seen." Lately, Harper's drawings had grown darker, literally. Thick lines with charcoal, jagged shadows, and in one image, a large figure looming behind a small girl with a dog crouched in front of her, teeth bared. Marla took notice. One afternoon, she called over Melanie Cross, who had begun checking in quietly during Harper's classes, pretending it was routine. "Have a look at this one," Marla whispered, holding up the latest drawing. Melanie studied it. She didn't need to ask who the tall figure was. Her gut tightened. "That dog," Marla said, lowering her voice. "He's always between the girl and the shadow. But the shadow keeps getting bigger in each drawing." Melanie nodded slowly. "Thanks, Marla. Keep me updated." Melanie wasn't a stranger to coded cries for help. Children spoke in silence when words failed them. She made a note to follow up sooner than planned. Back at the Moss house, Harper curled on her bed, a blanket draped over her lap. Shadow had been locked outside again. The wind howled faintly beyond the windows. Her fingers traced the hem of her old shirt, one of the few things that still smelled faintly like her mother. There was no warmth left in the room, even though the heater buzzed. She whispered into the dark, "I miss you, Mom." The next morning, Bradley was unusually cheerful. He told Harper he had a meeting and she'd stay home from school. Then, as if on cue, he reached for Shadow's leash and said, "Your dog's too much trouble. I'm taking him to the shelter this week." Harper froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Shadow stood behind her, tail still, eyes focused on the man's hand. "Don't look like that," Bradley said, grinning as he sipped his coffee. "He's just a dog." But he wasn't. Shadow was the one living creature that had never once made Harper feel broken. He was the only one who saw everything and didn't look away. Later that day, Harper sat alone in the yard while Bradley talked on the phone in his office. Shadow leaned against her legs and she clutched his ears gently. "If you leave," she whispered, "I won't know what's real." She pressed her cheek to his fur and stayed that way until the wind picked up and the sky turned gray again. In town, Melanie sat in her office late that evening, the drawing from art class laid out before her, next to a stack of files. She picked up the phone and dialed her supervisor. "I'd like to schedule a home visit, tomorrow, unannounced." The wind swept low and relentless across Pine Valley that night, whistling through the barren trees and rattling the brittle branches like bones. A winter storm was brewing, its breath thick with ice and anticipation. On Elmwood Street, most porch lights were already dimmed, and the town had retreated behind heavy curtains and furnace hums. But in one house, one with dark green shutters and a too-perfect lawn, something was unraveling beneath the surface. Inside the Moss home, Harper sat rigidly on her bed, her small hands clutched around the frayed corner of her blanket. The silence around her wasn't peaceful. It was brittle, about to crack. Her room was colder than usual, not in temperature, but in tone. Shadow was gone from her door tonight. Bradley had locked him in the detached shed earlier that afternoon, after an argument that began with spilled orange juice and ended with Harper being called clumsy, then sent upstairs without dinner. She had whispered apologies through the keyhole when she tried to check on Shadow, but the door was bolted from the outside. Shadow, the 3-year-old German shepherd, had barked softly in response, his way of telling her he was still there, still listening. At exactly 11:17 p.m., that soft bark shifted into something primal. Ray Thompson, who lived 2 houses down, sat up straight in his armchair. A retired railroad worker in his late 60s, Ray had lived on Elmwood for over 3 decades. A wiry man with a thick gray mustache and perpetually furrowed brows, Ray wasn't easily rattled, but the sound he heard through his kitchen window wasn't just a dog barking. It was a cry. A long, drawn-out howl followed by a sharp yelp. Then he could have sworn a muffled shout. He stood and shuffled toward the back door, his flannel robe barely covering the chill that crept up his spine. From his porch, the Moss house was cloaked in shadows, but a faint light flickered behind the side window. Then he heard it again, more distinct this time, a crash, then a male voice yelling something incoherent, and then silence. Ray hesitated, then went back inside and wrote down the time. He always wrote down things he thought might matter, a habit he'd picked up after his wife passed years ago. She used to remember everything. Now he tried to do it for both of them. The next morning, the silence was replaced with sirens. A white van from County Animal Control parked outside the Moss residence just after 9 a.m. From it stepped Calvin Parks, a soft-spoken man in his 40s with kind eyes, a stocky build, and a limp from an old leg injury. He'd worked in animal welfare for over 15 years, known in town for being fair but firm. but today he looked uncomfortable. Bradley greeted him at the porch with a bandaged hand and a grim expression. "It attacked me, out of nowhere. You'll find it in the shed." Calvin frowned. "Shadow, the guide dog?" Bradley nodded solemnly. "Not safe. Not for her, not for anyone." Inside the shed, Shadow sat quietly. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just looked up with calm defiance as if he knew what was happening. Calvin crouched slowly, meeting the dog's gaze. "No signs of aggression?" he murmured, running a hand over the dog's head. But orders were orders. He looped the leash around Shadow's neck and led him to the van, murmuring apologies beneath his breath. From her upstairs window, Harper couldn't see the van, but she could hear the click of the shed lock, the heavy door groaning open, the sound of paws on gravel. Then, silence. She pressed her face to the glass. "Shadow?" she whispered, then louder, panicked. "Shadow?" When the van's engine turned over, she screamed. Her cries echoed down the stairs, startling Ray Thompson, who had stepped onto his porch just in time to see the van pulling away. He watched the window where Harper had been, saw the shadow of her frame collapse against the pane. That evening, Melanie Cross arrived at the Moss home unannounced. Her expression was tighter than usual, the lines around her mouth pulled taut. She was dressed in her usual work layers, jeans, boots, a dark coat too thin for the cold, but her tone was professional as ever. Bradley met her at the door with a thin smile. "She's resting. Rough morning?" Melanie didn't return the smile. "I'd like to see her." "I'm afraid that won't be possible today. Doctor's orders." She was upset. Needed medication to calm down. Melanie's fingers twitched slightly, but she held her ground. "I need to speak with her." Bradley tilted his head. "Is this a formal welfare check?" "Not yet," Melanie replied. "But it could be." For a moment, the facade slipped. Bradley's jaw tightened. "She's fine. Shadow attacked me. I filed the report." "I've read it," Melanie said, "but I need to hear from her. I'll let you know when she's better." He closed the door, softly but firmly. Melanie stood there for several long seconds, her breath puffing white clouds in the air. Then she turned and walked toward the sidewalk, but not toward her car. She crossed the street to Ray Thompson's house and knocked twice. Ray opened it in a gray undershirt and slippers, squinting. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Thompson. I'm Harper's caseworker. Did you hear or see anything unusual last night?" Ray hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." Inside the cozy, cluttered living room, Melanie sat on a worn couch beside a wall of old train memorabilia. Ray handed her a notebook. "I heard the dog first. Real strange. Not like usual, barking, more desperate. Then a crash. Then nothing." Melanie scanned the entry, the time, the description. Then she looked up. "Do you have security cameras?" Ray nodded. "Just one, back porch, facing their shed, motion triggered. It's old, but it works." Her heart thudded. "Could I?" He stood and retrieved a small USB stick from a drawer. "Already downloaded it this morning. I don't like what I heard." Melanie took the drive with both hands. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. This might help more than you know." That night, she sat in her car outside her apartment and watched the grainy footage on her laptop. It was dark, but visible. The timestamp matched. A figure moved violently near the shed. A door slammed. The dog barked. No, howled. Then, the light inside the house went on, and a man's shadow moved toward the door. What she couldn't see, she could feel. Something had happened, and Harper had screamed for a reason. The orphanage was an aging structure nestled just outside the northern edge of Pine Valley, a former convent with long stone corridors, tall windows with peeling frames, and a silence that hung like a damp curtain. The winter chill seeped through the cracks in the floorboards, and the scent of old linen and lemon polish clung to every hallway. Harper Lee arrived wrapped in a coat too big for her, clutching a cloth bundle in her lap, an old, worn flannel towel that still held the faint scent of dog fur and pine. It was all she had left of Shadow. A woman named Cecilia Hart met her at the door. Cecilia was in her early 50s, tall and narrow, with a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the lines on her face. Her long skirts brushed the floor when she walked, and she smelled faintly of rosewater and coffee. Years of managing restless, wounded children had hardened her expression, but not her voice, which remained surprisingly gentle. She knelt in front of Harper, who said nothing. "I'm Miss Hart," she said softly. "You'll be safe here, sweetheart." Harper nodded once but kept her head down. She had not spoken since Shadow was taken. At night, she didn't cry. She didn't even toss in bed. She simply lay still, listening for sounds that would never come again. The soft click of claws on the floor, the gentle snuffle of breath beside her pillow, the warm weight of a body curled near her feet. But in dreams, he came. Every night. A silhouette of motion, a brush of fur, a low thrum like a heartbeat beneath the earth. On her third night at the orphanage, Harper was placed in room 12, a shared dormitory with 4 other girls, all of whom whispered and giggled long after lights out. One of them, June Mather, a freckled redhead with a raspy voice and a stubborn streak, tried to talk to her. "You're the blind girl, right? The one with the dog?" she asked, not unkindly, but directly. Harper didn't respond. She simply turned her face to the wall and clutched the towel tighter. June scoffed, not offended. "Whatever, just don't snore." By day, Harper followed the motions. She ate what was given, dressed when told, walked slowly with her cane, and sat in silence during activity hours. Miss Hart tried coaxing her with music therapy, tactile puzzles, even a small corner in the reading room where she could feel the shapes of Braille books. But Harper remained locked behind an invisible door. Only at night did she come alive in her dreams. One evening, while the other children were out for a movie night, Harper sat alone in the rec room. Her fingers traced the edge of her towel. She didn't need sight to remember how Shadow used to nudge it with his nose when he wanted to play, or how he'd curl around it when she left it near his bed. Her lips moved soundlessly, mouthing his name. Shadow. Miles away, in a cramped office inside Pine Valley's municipal building, Melanie Cross stared at her computer screen. Her hair was tied in a messy ponytail, her glasses pushed up on her head. It was nearly 11 p.m. She hadn't slept properly in 2 nights. A cup of coffee gone cold sat forgotten beside her. Next to the computer was the USB stick Ray Thompson had given her. She had already watched the footage 5 times, marking each second where something felt off. Now, she was preparing the evidence packet for the town magistrate. Helping her was Officer Lena Choi, a young patrolwoman assigned temporarily to child welfare support. Lena was of Korean descent, early 30s, with short black hair and a quiet, observant demeanor. She had joined law enforcement after growing up in foster care herself, and had a particular sensitivity to cases involving neglected or abused children. "You think they'll reopen the case based on this?" Lena asked, watching the pixelated clip once more. Melanie nodded. "It's circumstantial, but paired with Harper's behavior, the drawings, Ray's written statement, it's enough to raise questions." Lena leaned back in her chair. "What about the dog? He's still in holding. I called the shelter this morning. They're waiting on behavioral evaluation. If they clear him, he might be readoptable, but not to Harper." Melanie sighed. "Not unless we prove she needs him again." She paused, then reached for her phone. "I'm requesting emergency review. I'll send the footage to the town clerk's office tonight." Back at the orphanage, Miss Hart peeked into room 12 during her evening rounds. Harper lay on her bed, perfectly still, towel held to her chest. Her breathing was even, but her forehead was damp with sweat. She was dreaming again. In the dream, Shadow was running fast across snow-dusted grass. He wasn't barking. He wasn't afraid. He was coming for her. She could feel his warmth against her knee, hear the pant of his breath and the jingle of the metal tag on his collar. Then, a voice, one she didn't recognize, calling her name through fog. It wasn't Shadow's bark, but something older, like a memory she hadn't lived. "You have to tell them," it whispered. She woke with a start, sitting bolt upright in bed. The towel dropped to the floor. Miss Hart rushed in. "Harper?" The little girl blinked, her blind eyes wide, chest rising and falling rapidly. I had a dream," she said quietly. It was the first thing she'd spoken in 4 days. The courthouse in downtown Pine Valley stood like a square of stone against the winter sky, its granite pillars half hidden by a thin veil of morning mist. Ice coated the steps, and the trees lining the sidewalk were bare as bone. Inside, the atmosphere was not loud, but heavy, like a breath held too long. Harper Lee sat in a waiting room, just outside Courtroom 3B, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a dark blue wool dress with a collar that brushed her chin and a pair of white tights that kept sliding down her legs. The flannel towel, the one that once smelled like fur and pine, was now tucked inside her coat pocket, a talisman against the unknown. She couldn't see the people watching her, but she felt their eyes, felt the tension humming beneath the courtroom walls. Beside her sat Melanie Cross, her social worker, and the only adult whose presence Harper had come to recognize by the rhythm of her breathing and the subtle way her perfume smelled faintly of lavender and ink. Melanie wore a simple gray blazer, her hair tied back, her hands occupied with a folder she'd opened and closed a dozen times in the last hour. She leaned over and whispered, "They'll call us soon. Are you okay?" Harper nodded once. She hadn't spoken much since waking from the dream in the orphanage, but now something stirred inside her. Not courage exactly, but clarity. A pull, like a thread being drawn from somewhere deep in her chest. She had something to say, even if she didn't know how to shape the words. Across the hall, seated at the prosecutor's desk, was Assistant District Attorney Lauren Fielding, a woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones, shoulder-length chestnut hair, and a gaze that didn't flinch. She had worked for the county for nearly 2 decades, known for her unrelenting cross-examinations and an unusual empathy toward vulnerable witnesses. Lauren had agreed to reopen the case after reviewing the footage Melanie submitted, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. No bruises on record, no medical reports, only a video, a dog, and a silent child. Still, she trusted her gut, and her gut told her something was very wrong. On the opposite bench, Bradley Moss sat with his attorney, Jonas Crowley, a broad, balding man with expensive suits and a smug expression that rarely cracked. Bradley wore a pale gray sweater and a look of patient indignation, as if this entire event were a formality, an inconvenience to be dismissed. The judge, Honorable Denise Rollins, entered the room with an air of quiet gravity. She was in her late 50s, African-American, with a halo of silver curls and calm, deep-set eyes that had seen decades of lies, confessions, and pleas. Her black robe swayed as she sat, her gavel tapping once. "We're here to consider whether the minor child, Harper Lee, has been subject to emotional or physical abuse by her guardian. Let's begin." The court called Harper to the stand. Melanie walked her gently to the front, letting Harper use her cane but guiding her pace. The room hushed. The only sound was the tap of rubber against polished wood. When Harper sat, she was so small in the witness chair that the judge ordered a cushion brought so she could be seen. Ada Fielding approached. Her tone was soft. "Harper, do you know why you're here today?" Harper nodded slightly. "To talk about my uncle," she whispered. "Do you understand what it means to tell the truth?" "Yes," Harper said, her voice barely above breath. "It means I say what happened, even if it hurts." "Can you tell us what happened the night Shadow was taken?" Harper gripped the arms of the chair. Her chin quivered. "He didn't bite anyone. He only barked because my uncle was angry. He was hurting things. Shadow was scared for me." "And what about you, Harper? Were you scared?" Harper hesitated. "He told me no one would believe a blind girl." Her fingers curled tighter around the edge of the seat. "He moved my furniture so I'd trip. He yelled. He locked Shadow out in the cold." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Rollins raised her gavel. Ada Fielding leaned in. "Do you remember the last thing your dog did before they took him away?" Harper turned her face toward the sound of the question. "He put his head on my knee. He didn't bark then. He just stayed." Then, in a voice that came from a place far deeper than her size suggested, Harper said, "Shadow never barks for no reason. He only barks when I need help." Silence flooded the room. Across the aisle, Jonas Crowley stood sharply. "Objection, speculation. She's attributing motive to an animal." Judge Rollins considered, then nodded. "Objection noted. Let's proceed carefully." Fielding paused, nodded respectfully, and backed away. Melanie watched, heart pounding. It wasn't perfect testimony. It wasn't concrete, but it was real. And it had shaken the room. Back in the waiting area, Harper returned to her seat, pale and exhausted. Melanie crouched beside her, eyes darting toward the doors. "Now we wait," she murmured. "But I need to tell you something." Harper tilted her head. "I filed a motion early this morning," Melanie whispered. "I asked for Shadow to be brought in, just in case. It wasn't approved yet, but—" She trailed off as the courtroom doors creaked open behind them. A figure appeared in the hallway, Rita Hall, a shelter volunteer in her late 60s, with kind brown eyes, short gray curls, and a brisk but gentle demeanor. She wore a windbreaker over a volunteer vest and held a leash in one hand. At the end of that leash stood Shadow. He was freshly groomed, but still carried a scratch along his side that hadn't quite healed. His ears perked up at the sound of Harper's voice echoing through the courtroom. He pulled forward, tail wagging low and fast, then froze when he spotted her. In an instant he leapt, paws skidding slightly on the tile as he rushed toward the girl. Harper turned her head. "Shadow?" The leash slipped from Rita's hand, and within seconds, Shadow was beside Harper, pressing his body into her legs, whining low and vibrating with joy. Harper dropped her cane and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her cheek to his fur. The judge, hearing the commotion, entered the hall and witnessed the reunion unfold. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. For a long moment, the hallway outside courtroom 3B was a hush of pause and held breath. Shadow pressed his head against Harper's chest, tail slowly wagging, eyes bright and wet as if even he had missed her in more than just instinct. Harper knelt beside him on the tile floor, one arm around his thick neck, the other buried in his fur. The flannel towel had slipped from her coat pocket and lay forgotten on the ground. To her, this moment was everything. But inside the courtroom, the real storm was still gathering. Judge Rollins, who had stepped into the hallway to witness the reunion, cleared her throat gently. "Bring the dog inside," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I want to see what happens." Rita Hall, the shelter volunteer who had brought Shadow, hesitated only a second. She was a sturdy woman in her late 60s, her face lined not by age but by kindness long carried. A former veterinary nurse, Rita had been volunteering with the Pine Valley Animal Shelter since her retirement. Practical, unsentimental, but with a heart soft for animals, she had taken a special liking to Shadow during his brief stay at the shelter. "He's smarter than most men I've met," she'd once said, only half joking. Now she gave the leash a light tug and whispered, "Come on, boy." But Shadow didn't move toward Harper again. Instead, after one last glance at the girl, he turned head raised, tail stiff, ears erect, and walked straight into the courtroom. The room fell into stunned silence. Even Jonas Crowley, the defense attorney, blinked in surprise. Bradley Moss sat upright in his chair, his smile frozen mid-expression. Shadow's nails clicked softly against the hardwood as he padded across the courtroom. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. But every step was deliberate. He passed the judge's bench, sniffed the baseboard briefly, and turned toward the defense table where Bradley sat beside his lawyer. And then Shadow stopped. 2 feet from Bradley, the dog lowered his body slightly, ears forward. The growl that escaped his throat was not loud, but it was unmistakable. A deep rumbling sound from his chest, low and ancient, like a warning carved in stone. Bradley flinched. Rita, startled, stepped forward. "He's never done that before, never not once at the shelter," she said. Judge Rollins leaned forward. "Mr. Moss, is there anything in your clothing that might be affecting the dog?" "No," Bradley snapped quickly, too quickly. Shadow, unshaken, moved closer. He sniffed once, then again, then nudged the inside of Bradley's coat pocket with his snout. Once, twice, then let out a sharp bark. Jonas stood. "Your Honor, this is theater." But Judge Rollins raised a hand. "Let him finish." Shadow barked once more and pawed the pocket. Officer Lena Choi, who had been seated in the rear for security, stepped forward. "Permission to check the pocket," Bradley stammered. "There's nothing in." "Granted," Judge Rollins said. Lena reached carefully into the pocket. Her face didn't change as she pulled out a small amber bottle. She turned it in her hand, reading the label. "It's a prescription," she said quietly, "but not under Mr. Moss's name." Judge Rollins extended her hand. Lena passed the bottle to her. "It's a sedative," the judge murmured, "commonly used for high anxiety or to subdue pets, strong dosage." Bradley shifted in his seat. It's old. For the dog when we traveled. I forgot it was there." Melanie, seated behind Harper, clenched her fists in her lap. She had seen this tactic before, quiet control. Drugs used not for medical purposes, but for manipulation. Ada Lauren Fielding rose from her seat. "Your Honor, this new evidence supports the claim that Mr. Moss may have used this to sedate the child's support animal. It would also explain erratic behavior or the dog's protective instincts." Jonas tried to object, but the momentum had shifted. Then came the final blow. Judge Rollins looked to Harper. "Miss Lee, is this the dog that was with you the night in question?" Harper stood slowly. Shadow stepped beside her, unprompted, touching her leg gently. Harper nodded. "Yes. He barked when I needed help." And then her voice cracked, rising not in fear, but in something like relief. He still remembers. The courtroom was still. In that space between a child's truth and a dog's instinct, everything changed. Judge Rollins closed the file slowly, looking across the courtroom. "We will reconvene tomorrow to determine appropriate action regarding Mr. Moss's guardianship. In the meantime, the child will remain in temporary protective custody, and the dog stays with her." Bradley opened his mouth to protest, but one glance at Shadow's unflinching gaze silenced him. Harper exhaled shakily. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. The sun rose differently that morning. Pine Valley, still coated in patches of snow, shimmered with a kind of cautious warmth, as if spring had slipped quietly into the still frozen ground. In the crisp morning air outside the courthouse, the frost on the windows began to melt in thin rivulets, streaking the glass like tear tracks. Inside courtroom 3B, the air was heavy with the finality of justice long delayed. Harper Lee sat quietly at the front bench, flanked by Melanie Cross and Shadow, who rested obediently at her feet, his head nestled against her boots. Harper wore a soft beige cardigan over a lavender dress, the fabric smooth beneath her fingers. Her long hair had been brushed with care that morning by Melanie, who now sat poised but tense, a file folder resting unopened in her lap. They were waiting again, but this time with something heavier than fear, hope. Judge Denise Rollins entered the room promptly at 9, her robe trailing softly behind her. Her eyes swept across the courtroom, lingering briefly on Harper before she took her seat. The air shifted when she raised the file before her, the one now filled with incident reports, footage from Ray Thompson's camera, the recovered sedative, and detailed notes from multiple interviews with Harper, Shadow's handlers, and neighbors who had quietly stepped forward after seeing the news. To the side, Bradley Moss sat alone. His suit was the same one he'd worn the previous week, though now it looked looser, somehow more worn. His lawyer, Jonas Cruelly, was absent, having requested leave after the indictment was filed. Bradley's face was pale, jaw clenched, his eyes darting between Harper and the judge, then to Shadow. But Shadow never looked back. The dog remained still, alert, as if waiting for permission to believe that it was finally over. Judge Rollins cleared her throat. "This court has reviewed all submitted evidence regarding the guardianship and treatment of minor Harper Lee," she began, voice level. "It is the court's finding that Mr. Bradley Moss knowingly falsified adoption records, misused prescribed medication not registered under his name, and engaged in behavior constituting psychological and environmental abuse toward a child with disabilities." Bradley didn't flinch, but the slight tremble in his hands betrayed him. The dog in question, Shadow, displayed trained protective behavior that aligned with multiple incidents later confirmed by camera footage and the minor's testimony. The combination of verbal patterns, audio analysis, and behavioral evaluation strongly supports the claim that this dog acted in defense of the child. The courtroom was silent, but the air bristled with held breath. "Therefore," the judge continued, "this court is removing Mr. Moss's custodial rights effective immediately. A criminal investigation will proceed under the jurisdiction of the state. In matters of future guardianship," she looked to Melanie. "Ms. Melanie Cross, you have formally submitted an application for permanent adoption and legal guardianship. After review of your history, your evaluations, and the child's own response to your care, this court grants you full guardianship, effective today." Melanie's breath caught. Her fingers curled over Harper's hand gently, as if afraid this moment might shatter. Then Judge Rollins turned to Harper. "Miss Lee, I want you to know something. The bravery you showed in coming here, speaking out, when others stayed silent, changed everything. You reminded us that truth doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers, but it's still the truth." Harper didn't smile, but she reached down and touched the top of Shadow's head and whispered, "Thank you." That night, Harper didn't sleep in a sterile bed or under 2 white sheets in a dormitory or hospital. She lay beneath a quilt stitched with lilac and pine patterns in a small, cozy bedroom at the edge of town, a bedroom filled with music books, a window that faced the sun, and the soft strumming of wind chimes just outside. The house was Melanie's, a weathered two-story bungalow painted pale green, with ivy creeping up the back porch and daffodils beginning to push through the garden soil. Shadow had already explored every corner, first tentatively, then with tail high, ears alert. He had chosen his spot beside Harper's bed without prompting, curling up at night like he used to, with a sigh of contentment so deep it silenced all ghosts. Melanie decorated the room with care, shelves lined with touch-and-feel books, a tiny wooden desk, and on the windowsill, a small clay sculpture of a dog Harper had made during therapy. There was also a piano in the living room, old, slightly out of tune, but with a soul of its own. Melanie had inherited it from her grandmother, who once taught music before illness took her voice. "I don't know if you'll like it," Melanie had said that first night, "but you're welcome to try." And Harper did. Her fingers, once curled tightly in fear, now spread softly across the keys. She played by touch, not memory. At first, simple scales, then a hesitant waltz. Shadow would lay nearby, tail gently thudding against the floor in rhythm. Sometimes Melanie would sit with her, reading aloud or humming. And for the first time in a very long time, Harper didn't just feel safe. She felt at home. In the weeks that followed, word of the case spread across the county, not in scandal, but in quiet awe. A child had spoken through silence. A dog had testified without words. And a system, flawed though it was, had finally listened. One evening, Harper stood in the backyard with Shadow at her side. The wind danced through the trees, carrying with it the scent of lilac and something wilder freedom, perhaps. She lifted her face to the sky and smiled. The years folded gently into one another, the way soft pages close over a story too powerful to forget. Pine Valley didn't change much. Its winters still bit sharp. Its springs still flirted with life too early. But for Harper Lee, time moved like music. Not in a straight line, but in crescendos and rests, in small, echoing melodies that returned in unexpected ways. By the time Harper turned 15, she was taller, her features more defined, but the core of her gentleness remained. Her hair, still chestnut brown, reached just below her shoulders, often braided neatly by Melanie in the early mornings. She wore clothes chosen for touch more than fashion-soft textures, woven buttons, colors she remembered by feel, the velvet green, the linen blue, the cotton white. Her eyes, pale and unseeing, still flicked instinctively toward sounds, toward voices, toward things only she could perceive. She had learned to play the piano with not just accuracy, but emotion. Each note was a memory. She didn't memorize sheet music. She translated feeling into movement. When she played, the room changed. Silence leaned in. Shadow would lie beneath the bench, eyes closed, as if he too heard the story unfold from beneath her fingertips. Shadow had aged. His muzzle was now silvered, his steps slower, and his rest deeper. At nearly 10 years old, he carried himself with the weary dignity of one who had lived more than most. His ears still perked when Harper entered the room, and though he no longer sprang to his feet with youthful energy, his tail wagged, slow and steady, like a heartbeat she could rely on. Their bond remained unbreakable. He followed her still not out of duty, but devotion. In town, people recognized them instantly. Harper walking with her cane, Shadow matching each step beside her, like a shadow that knew how to wait. Melanie Cross, now. Melanie Lee, by legal paperwork, had continued to raise Harper with both freedom and structure. She had grown into her role as a mother with unexpected grace. Her hair had turned streaked with silver, her shoulders more relaxed. After years working in social services, she transitioned into nonprofit advocacy, creating outreach programs for children with disabilities. The piano in their living room remained the same, slightly out of tune, yet the most beautiful instrument Harper would ever play. It was during one of Melanie's community events that Harper was first asked to speak. It was a modest gathering held in the town library's multi-purpose room, filled with parents, volunteers, and children, some blind, others neurodivergent, all navigating invisible worlds of their own. A woman named Miss Dana Sellers, a tall, soft-spoken community organizer with silver hair and long scarves that flowed like banners, introduced Harper to the audience. "She's not here to tell you how to overcome blindness," Dana had said. "She's here to remind us how to see beyond it. Harper stood behind the podium, her fingers gently brushing the edges of a cloth she had tucked into her pocket, her old flannel towel, worn thin, frayed at the corners, but still holding the faint scent of fur and years. "I was 7 when I first stood in a courtroom," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "I couldn't see the people watching me, but I could hear them, and I could feel who believed me and who didn't." A hush fell over the crowd. "Back then, people said I was brave, but the truth is I wasn't alone. I never was. There was someone who saw the truth when no one else did. He didn't speak, he didn't point, he didn't argue, he just stood beside me." She reached down and touched Shadow's head. He sat beside her, wearing a special harness that marked his status as retired service dog. His ears twitched slightly at the mention of his name. "His name is Shadow. He was trained to guide me, but what he really did was guard me. When I couldn't find the words, he showed people what they refused to see. He taught me that love doesn't need eyes, it just needs presence." Several in the audience were already wiping their eyes. Among them was a boy about 9, blind in one eye and deeply self-conscious. His mother clutched his hand tighter as Harper continued. "I bring this with me," Harper lifted the towel, "because it still smells like him, like safety, like warmth, like home." She took a deep breath. "I don't need to see light anymore, because I had a shadow that never left my side." Silence held the room still. Then, quietly at first, and then louder, came the sound of applause, honest, rising, not just for what was said, but for what had been lived. After the speech, children lined up shyly to meet her. Harper spoke to each one with patience, her voice always level, warm, never rushed. When one child asked, "Is Shadow a hero?" Harper smiled and knelt down. "He's not a hero because he barked," she said gently. "He's a hero because he stayed." Later that evening, Harper sat beside Shadow on the back porch of their home. The wind was cooler now, the moon rising slowly above the tree line. Melanie watched from the kitchen window, arms folded, heart full. Harper leaned close and whispered into Shadow's ear, her hand resting on his graying fur. "You still guide me, you know, even when I walk alone." Shadow didn't move. He didn't need to. Some guides don't lead with leashes, they lead with loyalty. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes or speak in grand speeches. Sometimes they walk on 4 legs, wait outside locked doors, and love so quietly the world forgets to notice until it's too powerful to ignore. Shadow didn't bark for attention. He barked for truth. And because of him, a little girl found her voice. A courtroom found its courage, and we, perhaps, found our faith again. Maybe it wasn't just instinct. Maybe it was grace. Because when loyalty is pure and love is silent but fierce, even the darkest lies can't hide forever. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who still believes in the goodness we often overlook. Comment below. Has an animal ever stood by you when no one else did? And if you believe that even in silence, love can still speak the loudest, type Amen. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of quiet heroes, second chances, and the unseen miracles that walk beside us.